Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was presented to the Egyptian people as a living god, perfect, divine, untouchable, and yet the boy beneath the golden mask could barely walk. When archaeologists cracked open his tomb in 1922, they found over 130 walking sticks buried alongside him, many of them showing genuine wear patterns that confirmed they weren't ceremonial props, but tools he actually depended on. CT scans conducted in 2005 by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities revealed the truth his priests had spent decades concealing. Tutankhamun had severe bone necrosis in his left foot, consistent with Köhler disease II, along with what appears to have been a clubfoot, meaning every step he took was likely painful and visibly unsteady. DNA analysis added more layers to the picture, confirming he was the product of brother-sister incest, the inbreeding coefficient so high it had stacked congenital disorders across his entire body. He also carried multiple strains of malaria in his DNA, had a cleft palate, and showed evidence of a broken leg that may never have healed properly. He died at approximately 18 or 19 years old, and historians still argue over whether the immediate cause was infection, malaria, or the accumulated weight of a body that had simply been failing from birth. The pharaoh worshipped as the earthly embodiment of Horus needed a cane to cross his own throne room. Claudius. Claudius became Roman emperor almost by accident, and the reason nobody saw it coming is exactly the point. He limped, he trembled, he had a stammer so severe that speaking in public was nearly impossible, and his head bobbed with involuntary movements that made audiences uncomfortable. His own mother, Antonia Minor, reportedly called him a monster of a man and used him as her standard for stupidity, as in, he's a bigger fool than even Claudius. His family kept him hidden from official functions, excluded from public life, and quietly sidelined from any role of consequence, assuming his physical symptoms meant his mind was equally broken. Modern physicians looking at Suetonius's detailed descriptions in the 12 Caesars have proposed cerebral palsy, Tourette syndrome, or a motor disorder caused by a severe childhood illness, though no definitive diagnosis is possible from ancient text alone. What nobody anticipated was that all those years of being ignored had given Claudius time to become one of the most widely read, most deeply educated men in Rome. When the Praetorian Guard found him hiding behind a curtain in the palace after Caligula's assassination in 41 AD and dragged him out to name him emperor, the Senate was horrified. He reigned for 13 years, conquered Britain in 43 AD, reformed the Roman bureaucracy, and expanded the empire further than most of his able-bodied predecessors had managed. His disabilities had, paradoxically, kept him alive. Nobody had thought him worth assassinating. When he finally died in 54 AD, possibly poisoned by his wife Agrippina, Rome had been ruled for over a decade by the man his family had tried to make invisible. Richard III. Richard III has been called a hunchbacked, withered-armed monster by William Shakespeare, Tudor propaganda, and 5 centuries of popular imagination, and the truth, when it finally emerged from underneath a Leicester car park in 2012, turned out to be more complicated than either the legend or its debunkers suggested. The skeleton confirmed that Richard did have scoliosis, and it was severe. His spine curved sharply to the right, the result of adolescent-onset idiopathic scoliosis that would have made his right shoulder noticeably higher than his left and given him a visibly uneven silhouette under armor or court dress. Osteological analysis by the University of Leicester estimated the spinal curvature at a significant degree, enough to be obvious to anyone who stood near him. What the skeleton did not show was a withered arm. Both arms appeared normal, and there was no evidence of a limp. Shakespeare's portrait, commissioned in a political climate where discrediting the last Plantagenet king served Tudor interests, had taken a real disability and distorted it into a symbol of inner evil. The actual Richard III, according to the bones, was a physically active man who rode horses intensively, showed robust musculature consistent with military training, and died at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 fighting, not fleeing, sustaining multiple lethal wounds to the skull consistent with close-quarters combat. His scoliosis was real and visible, known to his court and his enemies alike, and weaponized into mythology only after he was safely dead and unable to object. Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled the Ottoman Empire for 46 years, commanded armies from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, and built an imperial apparatus so formidable that European powers spent generations trying to slow it down. And in the final years of his reign, he was frequently too crippled by gout to ride a horse. Gout is a brutal condition, even by modern standards, causing joint inflammation so severe that even the weight of a bedsheet can be intolerable. And for a sultan whose authority rested partly on the image of the warrior king leading from the front, it was a political problem as much as a physical one. His court physicians managed his condition as carefully as any military campaign, and his public appearances were choreographed to minimize visible signs of weakness. But the disease progressed. By the 1560s, he was sometimes carried on a litter, which, in a culture that venerated mounted warfare, was not a small thing to conceal. In 1566, at approximately 71 years old, he personally led the siege of Szigetvar in what is now Hungary, a campaign many historians believe he undertook partly to reassert his image as a conqueror, despite his deteriorating body. He died before the fortress fell, likely from heart failure or complications of his condition, and what followed was one of history's more extraordinary acts of political theater. His death was hidden from his own army for weeks, his body maintained in his tent, a physician reportedly impersonating conversations with him to prevent the morale collapse that news of the Sultan's death would have triggered. The fortress fell. The army returned home. The secret held just long enough. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain is the most medically catastrophic case of deliberate royal inbreeding in recorded history, and the Habsburg dynasty spent decades concealing the scale of the disaster they had created. He couldn't walk until he was 8 years old. He couldn't speak clearly for years after that. His jaw, the result of the famous Habsburg prognathism, amplified across generations of cousin and uncle-niece marriages, was so severely malformed that he couldn't chew food properly and swallowed most of it whole. Contemporary accounts describe him as drooling, physically weak, and cognitively limited, though the exact nature of his intellectual disabilities is difficult to assess because he was surrounded from birth by people invested in presenting him as capable. Geneticists analyzing his family tree have calculated his inbreeding coefficient at approximately 0.254. Meaning he was genetically more similar to the offspring of siblings than to a child of first cousins, the result of roughly 200 years of the Habsburg family marrying itself. He also suffered from epilepsy and what appears to have been a hormonal deficiency that left him unable to father children despite 2 marriages. His court and his mother, who served as regent during his early reign, understood that Charles's death without an heir would trigger a European succession war, so they kept him functional and visible for as long as possible, projecting the image of a ruling monarch around a man who was genuinely unable to govern. He died in 1700 at 38, and within a year, the War of the Spanish Succession had begun, ultimately redrawing the map of Europe exactly as his court had feared. Peter the Great. Peter the Great stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, reformed Russia from a medieval backwater into a major European power, and suffered from epileptic seizures. His court worked frantically to explain away as divine inspiration. He was 203 centimeters of contradictions, physically enormous, intellectually driven, capable of extraordinary bursts of energy and equally extraordinary violence, and periodically subject to episodes that dropped him to the floor without warning. Foreign ambassadors and diplomats witnessed these episodes directly, making complete concealment impossible, so his court developed an alternative narrative, framing his fits as moments of intense, spiritual, or passionate feeling rather than neurological malfunction. Peter himself understood the gap between the image of all-powerful autocrat he was constructing and the reality of a man who sometimes needed to be carried from a room. He may also have had Marfan syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that would account for his extraordinary height, unusually long limbs, and the cardiovascular complications that contributed to his death at 52, though that diagnosis is contested and based on retrospective assessment rather than documented medical records. Contemporary observers also noted facial tics and involuntary head movements that appeared independently of his full seizure episodes, recorded in diplomatic correspondence from European courts. None of it slowed him down in any meaningful way during his prime. He built St. Petersburg, modernized the Russian military, defeated Sweden, and traveled across Europe in disguise to study shipbuilding firsthand. He died in 1725, and historians still argue about whether his final illness was driven by urinary complications, cardiovascular disease, or the cumulative damage of a life lived at an intensity few bodies could sustain. George III. George III reigned over Great Britain for 60 years, through the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the loss of an empire, and spent much of that time fighting a condition his physicians didn't understand, couldn't treat, and refused to accurately describe to the public. His episodes were terrifying by any account. He would talk without stopping for up to 50 hours straight, foam at the mouth, say things so inappropriate that attendants had to clear the room, and then recover with apparent lucidity before collapsing again. For decades, the official explanation was simply madness, and the treatments he received, restraint chairs, cold baths, forced purging, reflected that assumption. In 1969, medical historians Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter proposed a different diagnosis: acute intermittent porphyria, a metabolic disorder that causes severe neurological and psychiatric symptoms when triggered by stress, infection, or certain medications. A key piece of evidence was that his urine was documented by his physicians as turning blue or purple during his acute episodes. A classic porphyria indicator that his doctors recorded carefully without having any framework to understand what it meant. The porphyria hypothesis remains debated, with some modern researchers preferring bipolar disorder as the explanation, but the political consequences of his condition are not in dispute. The Regency crisis of 1788 nearly transferred power to his son while he was still alive. When he became permanently incapacitated around 1810, the Regency Act of 1811 formalized what the court had been managing informally for years. He spent the last decade of his life blind, deaf, and wandering the corridors of Windsor Castle, talking to people who weren't there, while official bulletins described him as merely indisposed. Empress Dowager Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi effectively ruled China for nearly 5 decades, outmaneuvering emperors, foreign powers, and internal rivals through a combination of political intelligence and absolute control over her own image. And in her final years, her hands reportedly trembled, her movements slowed, and her health deteriorated in ways the imperial court worked systematically to conceal. She suffered from chronic dysentery for much of her later reign, which left her physically depleted and reliant on a small circle of trusted attendants who controlled access to her. Foreign visitors to the imperial court in her final decade noted that her audiences could be startlingly inconsistent, sometimes sharp and commanding, sometimes vague and distant, in a pattern some historians now associate with fluctuating neurological symptoms, possibly consistent with early Parkinson's disease, though that diagnosis is speculative and based on fragmentary contemporary descriptions rather than medical records. The system of ruling behind a curtain that defined her regency was not purely ceremonial. It physically separated her from observers, made her body language harder to read, and gave her staff the ability to manage how much of her physical condition was visible to the outside world. She died on November 15, 1908, at age 72, one day after the death of Emperor Guangxu, whose 2008 hair analysis confirmed arsenic poisoning at levels far above natural exposure, suggesting she had arranged his death while herself dying. She made political decisions until the final hours of her life, never publicly acknowledged any illness, and left behind a system of imperial concealment so complete that the full picture of her health is still being reconstructed from scattered diplomatic correspondence and court records. Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Wilhelm II was born on January 27, 1859, with Erb's palsy. His left arm was severely damaged during a prolonged and difficult birth, leaving it approximately 6 inches shorter than his right, withered, and almost entirely non-functional. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria, heir to the German Empire, and his disability was treated from childhood as a problem, to be hidden rather than accommodated. His mother, herself Victoria's eldest daughter, subjected the young Wilhelm to a series of painful and ultimately useless treatments, including mechanical devices designed to force the arm into normal positions, which achieved nothing except to deepen the psychological wound. Every official portrait, every public photograph, every carefully staged appearance for 30 years was composed to minimize the arm's visibility. He held gloves in it, kept it angled away from cameras, rested it on sword hilts, and had court photographers given explicit instructions about acceptable angles. What he couldn't hide was what the disability did to his personality. Historians have argued at length that his aggressive, overcompensating need to project dominance, his obsession with military parades and naval power, his explosive diplomatic behavior, his inability to back down from confrontations, was at least partly rooted in a lifetime of insecurity about his own body, shaped by a mother who made clear she found his arm an embarrassment. His erratic foreign policy in the years before 1914 has been analyzed through this lens, with some historians suggesting that a man who had spent 40 years performing strength to compensate for perceived weakness was psychologically ill-equipped to manage the careful compromises that European diplomacy required. He abdicated on November 9, 1918, and died in Dutch exile in 1941. The arm still shorter. The portraits still carefully angled. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt was President of the United States for 12 years, led the country through the Great Depression and most of World War II, and the majority of the American public had no idea he used a wheelchair. He contracted polio in August 1921. At 39 years old, was left permanently paralyzed from the waist down, and never walked unaided again. But the elaborate system of concealment his administration constructed around this fact was so effective that it shaped public perception of the presidency for a generation. The press operated under an informal agreement, never explicitly written down but universally understood, not to photograph Roosevelt being lifted, carried, or seated in his chair. Of the approximately 35,000 photographs taken during his presidency, fewer than 10 show the wheelchair. He could stand briefly with heavy iron leg braces locked at the knee and the physical support of an aide, and every public appearance was staged around this capability. Speeches delivered from fixed podiums, arrivals choreographed so he emerged already standing, motorcades arranged so crowds saw him upright in an open car. Foreign leaders, including Churchill and Stalin, knew the truth, and the question of whether adversaries like Hitler factored his physical condition into strategic calculations remains a genuine historical debate. His health declined significantly in his final year beyond the polio, visible in photographs from the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where he appeared gaunt and gray, and some historians argue the exhaustion and illness affecting him in those final months compromised his negotiating position with Stalin. He died on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia. Before the war, he had managed from a wheelchair reached its end. George VI. George VI was never supposed to be king. When his brother Edward VIII abdicated in December 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, the crown passed to a man who had spent his entire life dreading the one thing the job required most: speaking in public. George VI had a severe stammer that had defined and limited him since childhood, making every formal address a source of profound physical dread. He had been working with Lionel Logue, an unconventional Australian speech therapist, since 1926, a decade before he unexpectedly became monarch, and the relationship between them, documented in Logue's diaries, published in 2010, was longer, harder, and more incremental than the film The King's Speech suggested. He was never cured. His wartime broadcasts, the ones that rallied Britain during the Blitz and are now remembered as models of quiet courage, were agonizing to produce. Rehearsed repeatedly, delivered with enormous physical effort, every pause, the result of a man forcing words through a mechanism that didn't cooperate. He also suffered from severe anxiety, chronic stomach problems almost certainly worsened by stress, and was a heavy smoker throughout his adult life. He developed lung cancer, underwent surgery, and died on February 6, 1952, at 56 years old, younger than his father, younger than his daughter would be when she eventually stepped down. His decision to remain in London during the Blitz, to be seen at bomb sites alongside ordinary people while managing a body that was quietly deteriorating, is considered one of the defining moments of the British monarchy in the 20th century. He embodied a particular kind of courage that had nothing to do with physical strength, showing up anyway, every time, knowing it was going to be hard. Charles III. Charles III ascended to the British throne on September 8, 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. And in February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that he had been diagnosed with cancer, making him one of the only British monarchs in modern history to have a serious illness publicly disclosed while still reigning. The palace confirmed the diagnosis, following a separate procedure for prostate enlargement in January 2024, stating only that the cancer was not prostate cancer and declining to specify the type, which meant the announcement was both more transparent than anything a British royal household had issued in centuries and still carefully managed. Charles stepped back from public duties during treatment but continued with what the palace described as desk work, and his son Prince William took on significantly more public engagements during this period. He returned to public duties in April 2024, with the palace reporting a positive response to treatment, though full details of the diagnosis and ongoing prognosis remain undisclosed. What makes his case historically significant in the context of every royal on this list is precisely the contrast. Every predecessor here, from Tutankhamun hiding walking sticks in a tomb to Roosevelt's press corps agreeing not to photograph a wheelchair, operated under a system that treated royal disability as an existential threat to be concealed at nearly any cost. Charles's announcement, however carefully worded, however incomplete, represented a genuine departure from that tradition, an acknowledgement that the performance of perfect royal health has its own costs, and that a monarch being seen as human might, in the modern world, be a form of strength rather than a vulnerability. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.